to start with First, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So we at the New Israel Fund of Canada New Generation Council are uninvited guests in Toronto or Toronto, which is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the New Credit. Toronto is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We recognize the dispossession and displacement of Indigenous peoples and their enduring presence and connection to the land we today call Canada. Likewise, we recognize the dispossession and displacement of Palestinians and their enduring presence and connection to the land we call Israel and Palestine, a land many of us call home. As Jews, we know the pain of expulsion. We know what it means to be at the mercy of others. Drawing on our collective and personal histories, we honor the movements towards self-determination both here in Canada and in Israel and Palestine. Hello, my name is Landau, and I'm a member of the New Israel Fund New Generations Leadership Council. This recently formed Leadership Council will be leading all of the New Israel Fund of Canada's activities for New Generations. New Generations is a community of people in their 20s and 30s who actively support the advancement of progressive civil society and democracy in Israel, equality for all those living under its authority, and an end to the occupation. Today, we are thrilled to present our first event in our new speaker series, in which we bring you up to speed on a range of issues that have crystallized into the current situation in Palestine, Israel, starting with the forced expulsions in Sheikh Jarrah. In future sessions, we'll cover such key topics as 1948 and the Nakba, 1967 and the occupation, Oslo, Israeli settlements and annexation, Jerusalem, the blockade of Gaza, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and the conversation on apartheid. So stay tuned for notices about our future sessions. For today, we will discuss how a so-called real estate dispute tipped off rockets and bombing that killed 269 people, including 68 children in Israel-Palestine, what happened in Sheikh Jarrah, and how it fits into the wider context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To answer these important questions, we're really excited to have two experts from Jerusalem here with us today. During this event, please write any questions that you might have for our speakers in the chat. When we get to the Q&A portion, I'll call on people to unmute themselves and pose their own questions to our speakers. Or if you prefer that I ask the question for you, please note that in the chat and I'll be happy to. For now, I'd like to introduce our two speakers, Nivine and Aviv. Nivine Sandouka is an expert in the field of program development, management, peace building, and gender issues. She achieved her master's in democracy and human rights from Birzeit University and currently works with the German Association for Development Corporation, the AGEH. She is the executive director of Our Rights, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this properly, Hoqoqna-Our, a new NGO based in Jerusalem, which focuses on civic and political rights of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, especially women. She also runs a grassroots initiative called Judy, From Me to You, which aims to bring women together. She is a civil society representative of the International Reference Group for the World Council of Churches. Aviv Tatarsky, our second speaker, is a researcher for Amim, an Israeli NGO which focuses on Jerusalem in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He has been with Amim since 2012 and has been engaged in peace work for many years. Aviv has firsthand knowledge of the Israeli government's motivations and strategies for East Jerusalem. He is involved in monitoring Israeli settlement policies in Jerusalem, analyzing and drafting intervention suggestions regarding escalations in Temple Mount and Haram al-Sharif, and organizing Israeli action in solidarity with Palestinians in Jerusalem. Aviv also has 20 years of experience in martial arts and meditation practice. Along with many years of activism, this has led him to study and implement forms of nonviolence and nonviolent struggles. So, without further ado, we would like to welcome Nivine and Aviv. The first question we have for today is for Aviv. Aviv, if you can walk us through what is Sheikh Jarrah, and if you can give us a brief history of the land of Sheikh Jarrah. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you so much for all the work that NIF Canada is doing, and for specifically this event and inviting us to speak. So, what is Sheikh Jarrah? I'm gonna describe Sheikh Jarrah, but it's very important to listen to it, to look at it as a microcosm of East Jerusalem at large, of Israeli policies in East Jerusalem, and to understand that Sheikh Jarrah is an example, and that like it, we can speak of other examples in East Jerusalem. So the policies there are not at all unique, okay? And Sheikh Jarrah is a Palestinian neighborhood. On the one hand, of course, over the Green Line, so it's in what we call East Jerusalem, in the area that Israel occupied in 1967 and unilaterally annexed. And as far as the Israeli government and even most of the Israeli public are concerned, East Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah are basically part of the state of Israel, just like West Jerusalem, just like Haifa, just like anywhere inside the Green Line, okay? It is a Palestinian neighborhood, by which I mean not only that it is beyond the Green Line, but the population is Palestinian. It's not a big neighborhood, several thousand Palestinians live there. And very significant, it's very close to the old city, okay? So it's about 1.5 kilometers north of the old city, north of the entrance to the old city, which is called Damascus Gate, which you may have heard of in the news recently. And that's also, of course, part of the story. Now, why is this significant? Because, 54 years after 1967, with Israel, succeeding to keep unilateral or sole control of Jerusalem, not to share it with any Palestinian body, not to say state. Still, these areas, the old city and neighborhoods around it, are predominantly Palestinian. We have 100,000 Palestinians living there in this area. We have very few Jews living there. And this is not just any part of Israel-Palestine or just any part of Jerusalem. This is, of course, where the most symbolic places are, be it, of course, Temple Mount, Haram al-Sharif, be it many other places of religious, national, and so on significance. And Israel is working very, very hard to change that situation, okay? The places that, let's say, Jewish nationalists view as core of Jewish identity cannot be tolerated to stay Palestinian, okay? And actually, if we go 73 years back to before 1948, the area was predominantly Palestinian, but there were also Jews living in Sheikh Jarrah. There were several dozen Jewish families living there. And as tension grew, as hostilities broke out, by 1948, those Jewish families had to leave. Okay, so they became refugees. And of course, this was not unique. There were other places that Jewish neighborhoods or Jewish towns that fell under Jordanian control. The Jewish population, Jewish communities were uprooted. And of course, it also happened to Palestinians. If we check numbers, far many more Palestinian communities and Palestinian people who were uprooted and became refugees in 1948. Okay, come 1967, okay, Israel controls the area. In the 19 years between 48 and 1967, Palestinian families come to live in what used to be Jewish property. Okay, same thing happened in West Jerusalem, just the opposite, like Jewish families going to live inside property homes of Palestinian refugees. And Israel has to ask itself, what do we do with these properties? And coming back now to what I opened with, the idea of, let's say this used to be Jewish property, it needs to go back to its so-called Jewish owners. This can serve very strongly or very efficiently this aim of, let's change Sheikh Jarrah, let's have Jewish settlements there, let's maybe even Jewadize it completely. And that's at the root of what has broken up in the last couple of months, although it's not new at all. Now for 20 years already, you can say even longer, but this specific settler organization for just 20 years has been working to evict Palestinian families from property that was owned by Jews from before 1948. And if we speak of numbers, we're speaking in Sheikh Jarrah of about 75 Palestinian families who can face eviction demands. Out of these, several were evicted in the past, and 7 families are facing eviction in these specific months, which caused a protest, which was very widespread. And I'm sure you heard about it. The news reached probably Toronto as well. So that's in our context. That's what we're speaking about when we speak of Sheikh Jarrah.
Thank you so much, Aviv. And that ties us nicely into our next question for Nivine, which is, if you can tell us more specifically about the events that took place in Sheikh Jarrah and the surrounding areas over the last few months.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you today. I'm a Palestinian and I live in Jerusalem. And my house is actually a little bit close to Sheikh Jarrah, but my office is in Sheikh Jarrah. And I'm talking to you right now from Sheikh Jarrah, where I cannot even describe the smell around me, because yesterday, again, the Israeli police sprayed us with what we call the skunk, which is like a very bad smell that stays. It's I'm sorry to be giving you the actual thing, but this is what I'm surrounded with right now in Sheikh Jarrah. So what actually happened? I would like to first of all agree with Aviv that Sheikh Jarrah itself is a microscope, is a micro community of what is happening in Jerusalem in general. And as a Palestinian, we don't have citizenship. So this is kind of also what also makes us all the time feel so insecure. We don't have an Israeli citizenship. We have a residency, which means that also our presence in Jerusalem can be revoked according to a couple of laws which the Israeli state is implementing on us. And that's the first thing. The second thing said that the Israeli state doesn't really allow us to grow and to build our neighborhoods. So even if we're talking about expanding in East Jerusalem, we still need to get permits from the Jerusalem Israeli municipality and from the Israel government to be able to expand, which really happens rarely. So if you find a house in East Jerusalem, you really need to stay in it and kind of like, cling to it, because there are no alternatives. And once you start thinking of going and living somewhere else, like in the West Bank, in Bethlehem, or in Ramallah, your residency is going to be revoked. So you lose all your rights as a Palestinian living in Jerusalem. So that's why it makes us feel so insecure again, and to feel that our houses are being taken away from us. Now that said, as Aviv mentioned, this issue hasn't been it's not new. The first evictions were in 2002, actually. That's when the families started to be evicted from Sheikh Jarrah. Another families were evicted in 2008. And now this, together with other neighborhoods like Silwan, which is even closer to the old city. The idea started that, I think it started with young Palestinians actually, understanding the right to resist and the right to resist non-violently. So the idea of creating hashtags and social media, which is, I'm pretty sure you're all familiar with the hashtag already, hashtag Save Sheikh Jarrah, which the 2 young people from Al-Kurd family that is under the threat of being forcefully evicted from their house started. Media started getting attention on it, and more people started talking about it. But it's really interesting to know that it's not that Sheikh Jarrah was the peak of the events. Actually, something else was happening at the same time, which was happening at Damascus Gate in the old city of Jerusalem. And it started immediately on the first week of Ramadan, when for us, if you're ever in the region during Ramadan, Ramadan is a very special time for us in Jerusalem, because this is the only time where we feel as Palestinians, we are able to celebrate something nice in the city. So at night, we usually stay in Damascus Gate, especially for young men. We go to and do prayers in Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's a very special holy month for us, especially in Jerusalem. So the police started by provoking young people at Damascus Gate and closing Damascus Gate for them. So they were unable to gather. Unable to gather with increased stress of what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah, started those clashes between Israeli police and young Palestinian men. There were also, I have to say, some social media, TikTok videos showing, I don't know, I think it was a challenge or something between young people of attacking Jewish residents of the city. And that also went viral. So on top of everything else and the tension that was happening, those videos were happening. And then you see Israeli extremists trying to, also preparing for a large attack, if I might call it, on Palestinians in Ramadan in Damascus Gate. Now, the thing is, there's already tension going on. And one might ask, what is the role of the police in all of this? Why aren't they stopping such a racist, a march from taking place? And unfortunately, instead of finishing that, ending that march, the racist Lahava march, they were actually doing clashes with the Palestinian in Sheikh Jarrah. So according to Nir Hassan, and it's an article that was published recently in Haaretz, he said that 99% at least of the demonstrations that were happening in Damascus Gate and Sheikh Jarrah were peaceful protests that were received by 100% violence by the Israeli police. That was one thing that was happening almost on a daily basis. But at the same time, there's something else that was going on, which is the Jerusalem Day. And that is another march which Israeli extremist groups actually do in Jerusalem, with the flags entering into the old city of Jerusalem and trying to enter Al-Aqsa Mosque. Here we're talking about Ramadan, holy month, people praying throughout the day. And then the Israeli government is provoking at that time to go on with these marches. And then during the days, we would hear more and more the Israeli police going into Al-Aqsa Mosque and all these videos coming out with the Israeli police attacking prayers. So it's kind of like, it was really scary to be in the city at that time. Clashes ongoing in Al-Aqsa and in Damascus Gate and in Sheikh Jarrah. But at the same time, something else also happened, which is the Palestinians inside Israel, who also, with Israeli citizenship, who are also Muslims, and they're also, the Al-Aqsa is also means something to them. So they also joined in everything else that was happening. So for the first time, we see, for example, a strike happening throughout Israel and Palestine, unifying all the Palestinians together. And of course, I'm not going to forget Hamas. Now people say, Palestinians support Hamas in Jerusalem. It's not that we support Hamas, that we carry the same mentality as Hamas or the same ideas. It's that the Palestinians felt so helpless in Jerusalem of what was going on, and such an injustice that is being, enforced on them by the occupation, basically, that the only way out, like, help us, was kind of through Hamas and the attack of the rockets that happened on both sides, of course, and all the different people that died. But it meant something for Palestinians in Jerusalem. It basically meant that it just captured the spirit of resistance. Those two things that were happening, the unification of Palestinians from across West Bank, Gaza, and inside Israel, but also the Hamas and the resistance. It gave us hope that maybe one day we are going to regain our rights. And at the same time, the non-violent action was continuing in Sheikh Jarrah and in Damascus Gate. But afterwards, we saw thousands of young men being detained in Israeli prisons, Palestinians. At the same time, we were seeing settler attacks across Jerusalem, not only in Sheikh Jarrah, which the media didn't highlight. I myself, we stayed up until sometimes 5 in the morning with clashes around our houses. I'm talking about areas northern to Sheikh Jarrah, like Beit Hanina and Shafat. And some settlers even attacked Palestinian neighborhoods with weapons. Several people were wounded. And this is where, again, the injustice comes in. These settlers were detained by Israeli police for a couple of days, and then they let them go. While at the same time, Palestinians, even yesterday, they were still attacked by the Israeli police, excessive force. And as I began my answer, the smell all around us in East Jerusalem. So I'll try to kind of summarize it all in a way, but the main aim of all of this, the peaceful demonstrations and the hashtags and the using of social media, was to highlight specifically Sheikh Jarrah and the forceful displacement of the Palestinians, but also what is happening in Al-Aqsa and Jerusalem.
Thank you so much, Nivine. That was a lot of content that you fit into a very short amount of time. So thank you so much for that. So question 3 for Aviv. Again, tying into the same issue, we're noticing that the Israeli government is calling this, in quotes, a real estate dispute. So what's that all about, and why is it being called a real estate dispute, and what's the background on that specifically?
Right. So officially speaking, if we look at the mechanism, how the eviction demands are filed against Palestinian families and so on, it's based on property rights. And there are either private Jews or sometimes, individuals or sometimes organizations that come to the court. They say, look, we have the documents, it's our property, and these are squatters, and we demand that they leave, okay? Now, if we view this as a political issue, then of course there is the state of Israel acting against occupied population, taking away from them or at least not accepting their right to their homes. You can even say it contradicts international law, right? Because it's in the occupied territory, and they're forcing population to uprooting population and so on. So Israel had it very comfortable that in the last few years, evictions were taking place, for example, in Silwan, and not drawing much attention. It was going, the Palestinians and Israeli human rights groups weren't able to draw much attention to evictions, for example, in Silwan, or even in Sheikh Jarrah in 2017, there was an eviction of a family. Now, through what Nivine described, both the grassroots protest in the streets and the social media, before the Hamas attacks, okay, this was already having an effect, a huge effect, before Hamas fired even one rocket. Okay, this put Israel under a lot of pressure. There was international media, there was Israeli media. You know, these things that usually don't get covered. All the media outlets, Palestinian, Israeli, international, were in Sheikh Jarrah day after day after day. This was reaching the whole world, and it was in the Knesset, it was in embassies. Israeli government was getting a lot of pressure from the international community. So then for the government, maybe the escape route was to say, look, it has nothing to do with us. We're not demanding the evictions. These are property disputes between individuals or organization and the Palestinian. It happens to be that one side is Israeli and the other side is Palestinian, but this is, you know, this is coincidence, and it certainly has nothing to do with the government. The truth is that none of these evictions could take place without very direct assistance of the Israeli government. I'll try to outline a few steps very, very quickly. First, what makes it Jewish property in the first place? Okay, Israel made two laws. Okay, one law claiming that property inside the Green Line, West Jerusalem and other places inside the Green Line that used to be Palestinian property until 1948, Palestinian refugees lose title to the property they left behind, and it becomes state property, and then the state hands it over to Israeli citizens. Okay. Then after 1967, Israel made a second law saying property that Jews lost in East Jerusalem in 1948, so in the same war, okay, actually it remains their property. They're entitled to demand it, regardless of whatever happened between 1948 and 1967. And what happened between 1948 and 1967 are Palestinian refugee families from West Jerusalem, from Jaffa, from Haifa, from many, many places, coming and actually living in the homes that where Jewish families used to live. Okay, they themselves, these Palestinian refugee families, cannot reclaim their property in the Green Line because of the first law I described. And now settler organizations using the second law I described can throw them out of their homes once again. So this is the basis of it all, and it's not accidental. It's of course with a very political goal behind it, these two laws. Furthermore, Nivine described the assistance the police is giving, and the Jerusalem municipality is aiding eviction demands, and and Israeli ministers, and basically none of this, so this threat on such a very basic human right, your right to your home, could not actually take place without very close and you can even say intimate assistance by the Israeli government to ideological settler organizations.
Thank you so much, Aviv, for summarizing that. So our last question before we jump into question and answers from the audience is for Nivine again. And we just wanted to ask, I know you touched on this briefly in the second question, but what are some of the actions Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah are doing and thinking about doing this?
Yeah, so Sheikh Jarrah has been an amazing example of nonviolent resistance. So we see people, first of all, young people using their mobiles as a means to record what is happening over there and let the world know about it. The usage of the hashtag Save Sheikh Jarrah was also launched, and it's still being used. I'm not sure how trendy it is right now, but people are still using it. They use, for example, marches as peaceful march between Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood and Silwan neighborhood as an act of solidarity between the two neighborhoods that are being under the threat of demolition. Right now, just because the police were also aware that, when people are gathering, they're also empowering those families in a way, even though it was peaceful. But right now, Palestinians cannot enter that area if you don't live there. So, so it's kind of all the pressure right now is on the residents of that area itself. Meanwhile, if you're an Israeli Jew, you can enter easily. So just kind of to give you the balance of what is really going on. I know that they also drew lots of paintings on the wall about that resistance and liberation, which the Israeli police also felt very threatened by, and they drew over it. They used balloons, regular balloons with the colors of the Palestinian flag, which also the Israeli police felt very threatened by and took away. And the last, it's really amazing to see the persistence and the level of nonviolent actions these young people are making and doing. And I have to say that there are some Israeli movements that are supporting them. For example, you have a movement called Standing Together, that are supporting the Palestinians over there. Some others are doing protective presence. So in a sense of, just being there. And one testimony that I actually heard from an Israeli friend recently is that you don't know where to hide when you are in Sheikh Jarrah anymore, because there's no place that is safe. And we have seen videos where young woman is just standing at the gate of her house, and she was shot by the police in her back. We don't know if she's ever going to be able to walk again or not. She's still in hospital, and she's like 17 years old. Like, this is the actual situation right now. The Palestinians are trying to raise their voice to the world using social media means, but that is being faced by excessive force of Israeli government and police. And even they're trying to kind of hide it from the media. Just 2 weeks ago, I think Jivar al-Buderi, that is a reporter for Al Jazeera network, was also attacked and arrested in Sheikh Jarrah, which is another kind of, where is the freedom of the press here? He's just like trying to cover what is happening. And basically that's what's happening in this small, thing called Sheikh Jarrah. But at the same time, we also are seeing demonstrations in Silwan and sit-ins in Silwan as well. Yesterday, again, there were clashes in Damascus Gate, and it's so obvious. And thankfully, we have, speaker phones, we have cell phones and technology, where people can just take videos of what is happening and upload it on social media. And again, it shows how the police and the soldiers, actually, they were the ones who started these clashes as well in Damascus Gate yesterday. So this is the situation right now, and hopefully it will be, they will get justice soon, at least in this small neighborhood, because I think it's important to note the location of Sheikh Jarrah. The location is extremely important. If the Palestinians are evicted from Sheikh Jarrah, that means that there is no geographical continuity in East Jerusalem between the north and the south. It lies immediately in the middle of it. And if you put settlers over there, I don't mind having an Israeli neighbor, for example, who believes in my rights as a human. But the problem is the people who live in those areas are extremists in their ideology, and who even revoke my right to be living as a human. And I also heard sometimes that these people who move into those places are actually paid to do so by American-funded organizations, according to different news reports. So, and for Palestinians as well, I have to say that it's true that they go to the Israeli court system to get an appeal or to get a court order, but we truly, as Palestinians, don't believe that this is justice, because the whole Israeli system, as Aviv mentioned, is built and based on a supremacy of one group over another, of giving rights to one group over another. So I'm not sure if even they have a court order, what they're going to do with it. But we remain hopeful.
Thanks so much, Nivine. So our first question from the audience, which I'm just going to ask, is about the Israeli Supreme Court. And the audience asked, the Israeli Supreme Court has asked the Attorney General for a recommendation on this issue being the Sheikh Jarrah, what's being called the real estate issue. And could there possibly be a favorable assessment by the Attorney General, because all these evictions violate international law? Might they rule or recommend against these evictions? And yeah, Aviv, I think if you want to take that question,
Sure.
That would be great. Thanks.
Right. So until now, there have been dozens of eviction cases in the Israeli court over the years, and almost all of them have ended in approving the evictions, and all of them have taken place within the court. Okay, so looking formally at what the Israeli law says and determining the case according to that. Now, this summoning the Attorney General to give his assessment of the situation is something very, very new that is happening for the first time. It appeared first in an eviction case in Silwan, this neighborhood has been mentioned here several times because that is also the other major neighborhood where intense settler activity is taking place, along with the threat of eviction of Palestinian families. And it also came up this May in the eviction demands against 7 families in Sheikh Jarrah. The Attorney General has already replied in regards with the Sheikh Jarrah case, and he said, I refrain from getting involved. I don't think I should be involved in this case. So that's very disappointing for us, for the families. I'll explain in a minute why. In Silwan, there has not yet been a response. The Attorney General replied that he needs more time and he asked for an extension. So we don't know what's going to happen in Silwan. Why is this important? Because also in the previous question you asked me about the property dispute, I pointed to the fact that it's a political issue, okay? And getting the Attorney General involved would be the first time that formally the Israeli government is tied to the eviction demands, okay? So this is really a recognition of the political aspects, at least some of them, partially, political aspects of these eviction cases. So who knows what will happen? It can give us more maybe opportunities to apply pressure to the government to hold it accountable if indeed the Attorney General gets involved in the cases in Silwan. What we need to remember, and this Nivine also said, what we need to remember is that, Palestinians in East Jerusalem, they are not citizens. They don't have political representation. They don't have representation in the Knesset. They don't have representation in the government. So the laws and the policy are being done without them having an influence. They're not part of the game, but the laws apply to them, okay? And of course, the court system works according to the laws. And in the court, the judges are Israeli, okay? And they have, naturally, they have an Israeli Jewish narrative and the Israeli Jewish bias and so on. So thinking that we can have justice from the Israeli justice system in this situation is something, it's very, very far-fetched. So we cannot rely on the court to provide here a just solution. We need to find other ways, other mechanisms, public pressure, and the government needs to be accountable.
Thank you so much, Aviv. Nivine, is there anything you wanted to add to that before we go on to the next question?
No, I think Aviv covered it perfectly well. To tell you the truth, even as a Palestinian who lived throughout my life in Jerusalem, as Aviv mentioned, because the lack of political representation, we're also lack political awareness of how things move in Israel and what is the importance of what, unless you're a lawyer or like an activist in legal issues. So even for me, I didn't understand this importance of the Attorney General before. So thanks, Aviv, for pointing that out.
Thank you. So our next question is from Maytal. And Maytal, if you want, you can just unmute yourself and ask the question to the speakers.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about who the settlers actually are and what that movement is. My understanding is that when they talk about ties to Sheikh Jarrah or Silwan, the settlers in question who are trying to take over that property don't actually have direct ties. Like there's no real historical documentation that they themselves or their families necessarily have any history or claim to that land. It's more so just that like they're Jewish and they feel they want to live there because it's Jerusalem. And I think there's maybe a lack of knowledge around the actual settler movement and the settlers themselves and their goals and intentions. And I was just wondering if you could speak to speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, all I can say about that, Aviv, I think we will be better able to explain it. But from a Palestinian point of view, we know that, as you mentioned, the settlers who move in these houses, for us, from our point of view, are extremists. They are not the ones who come with peace and love. They are the ones who, if you see in Hebron, for example, in the old city of Hebron, they give you a very hard time. Then they make sure that your life is hell because they want you to leave. It's the same people who in 2014 kidnapped a child, a Palestinian child in Jerusalem and burned him alive. It's those people that we are dealing with from a Palestinian perspective, while at the same time we are aware that, for example, you have movements, Jewish movements, that actually believe in the rights of Palestinians. So it's really sad that Jewish is kind of attached to those extremist groups. I'm sure Aviv can explain a little bit more what I mean.
Right. So, you know, in the captions, I've noticed that one of the times now, instead of writing settlers, it was written toddlers. So I think that can be a very nice, very enticing way to look at it. And I'm going to say something in that regards. So first, directly to the question, you're very, very right. The settlers coming, you know, first throwing a Palestinian family out of the street and then coming and living in its home, they have no link, no connection to the Jewish families, to the Jewish communities who used to live in these places until 1948. So sometimes through paying money to the Jewish heirs and the so-called buying their rights, according to the Israeli law, they have rights to the property. So buying their rights, either that's how they can claim possession, or sometimes, again, the state colludes with them and transfers property rights to them. So they are doing it out of ideological reasons, and they are very, very extreme. And that's why what Nivine said is very, very right. Okay, it has nothing to do with, oh, it's my home that or my grandfather's home that I really want to come back to. It's something very, you can call it fundamentalist, hardliner, and so on. But, and then I'm going to say something here, I'm saying it with a purpose. These ideological people, okay, they are willing to give up quite a lot in order to realize their ideology, okay? And it's something that's really, really important to them. It really means a lot to them. And what is their goal, their aim is, they would not describe it as our aim is to throw Palestinians out of their homes or even throw Palestinians out of Sheikh Jarrah. They will speak about patriotism, about Zionism, about the connection to Jerusalem, what Jerusalem means to them, what these religious places in Jerusalem mean to them. You know, in Sheikh Jarrah, there's a site that's believed by Jews to be an ancient, a tomb of an ancient Jewish sage, not to mention, you know, what the old city means to Jews and so on and so on. And this has a lot of power. Okay, this has a lot of power in the Jewish psyche, in the Jewish public opinion. And that's why when we speak here, we can very easily call it extremist, nationalistic. And of course, that's how I see it. But in the general Jewish Israeli public and maybe Jewish diaspora public as well, this ideology carries with it a lot of power that people identify with it emotionally and in their identity and so on. So we really have a huge challenge here to overcome it, okay? And I think see, those of us that are Jewish, you know, I mean, I know most of us here in this webinar are Jews. We have, of course, our identity and the connection we feel to Israel, to Jewish identity, to Jerusalem. Otherwise, we wouldn't be interested in this issue at all. So we need to challenge ourselves as well, okay? And to see what are the prices I am willing to pay, okay? How do I bring together, on the one hand, the way I understand Jewish identity and its connection to certain places in this land that I call Israel and that Palestinians call Palestine, and with very real issues of human rights, of self-determination, of right to community. And when one thing comes to conflict with the other, what do I choose? And how do I explain it to myself? And how do I explain it to other people?
Thank you, Aviv. So we have one last question from the audience before we're gonna go into closing. And so the last question is more for Nivine, and if you can speak more, and I know you touched on this a little bit about the ethnic cleansing taking place in Silwan and Beta. And then perhaps, Aviv, if you want to touch on the second part of that question is, were they also inhabited by Jews many years ago?
Yeah, so the issue of Silwan specifically is not something new. Just 2 days ago, I was riding my car and I went to a very high place in Jerusalem where you can see the valley of Silwan right in front of you. I wish I had taken a picture of it because it's the disaggregation is so clear. You can see one house with the Star of David, very huge, lit up in the middle of the valley. A couple of them, maybe 3 or 4, and then next to them or around them, you can see another house, but with the moon, you know, the crescent, the sign of Muslims. So it was shocking for me to see Jerusalem so disaggregated in a way that this is a Jew, this is a Muslim, that's a Christian, but there's no Christians, I think, living in Silwan because I didn't see any cross. But it's been going on for a while. And I think what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah is not unique in that sense, because it has been happening in Silwan years before. I have a friend of mine whose son is less than 20 years old. And for the past couple of years, he has been in and out of detention centers and questioning ever since he was 12 years old, simply because he lives in Silwan and simply because there are the clashes with the settlers all the time and the police violence. And as Palestinians, we're talking about whole neighborhoods being evicted for the sake of Jewish extreme organizations coming in and taking over. And I think it's really good that they kind of understood the importance of social media and mobilization through social media. So that's why now people are more and more aware of what's happening in Silwan. Again, the court order was also postponed for another date. So we still don't have a court order on it. And as you mentioned, the Attorney General still didn't give an opinion about it. So, but it's important to note these events are not new. This is a daily life of Palestinians in Jerusalem. Silwan, Sheikh Jarrah, At-Tur, neighborhoods. So it's always happening. And unfortunately, I don't have actual data on number of families right now. But yeah, it's been ongoing for a while.
And Aviv, did you want to touch on the last part of that question, which was just, so these other areas, CO1 included, do they also have a Jewish history from many years ago?
Right. So I see 2 names mentioned here, Silwan and Beta, and I'll use the 2. So Silwan, certainly, you know, being so close to the old city of Silwan, before 1948 was a Palestinian village, but being so close to the old city, Jews also settled there. They were probably a minority, but there were Jews and Jewish communities in Silwan, and that today is being used in a similar way we described in Sheikh Jarrah. Okay, so in that sense, it's similar. Beta is a very different story. Beta is a village in the West Bank. Okay, and there's no need to go into the details of what's happening in Beta, but what I want to use is say there are the Israeli government, and I'm an Israeli citizen, but still the Israeli government is using a variety of mechanisms to dispossess Palestinians. Okay, we focus here in this hour on the home evictions based on previous Jewish ownership. In Beta, it's something completely different, but also in East Jerusalem, the municipality and the government are using other forms, other means, okay? So what we focus on today is one very specific and very important means, but we shouldn't think that it stands alone. You know, there are things that run very, very deep, and it all comes at the end to the question, is Israel willing to recognize that this country, Israel, that we call Israel, is also Palestine, that there is a Palestinian people living in this country, and that we have to understand how we are sharing this country, in what way, in this land, in what way are we going to do it or not? Are we going to fight and dispossess, you know, to whatever future lies ahead?
Yeah, and if I might just highlight this thing, it's also happening in all the shared cities across Israel. This notion of always keeping Palestinians at a 30% versus 70% Jewish population. And it's definitely, as Aviv said, the home evictions is just one method of by which Israel or the system maintains this ratio of 30 to 70. Also, as mentioned earlier, like we're like 340,000. 140,000 of us lives behind the wall, yet they are considered to be Jerusalem citizens. And mostly, maybe I would say more than 70% of us are residents with no citizenship whatsoever, which on its own is one way to get rid of us. Yani, besides the home evictions and demolitions.
Thanks so much, Nivine and Aviv, for addressing that. So one more just really brief question, although it's kind of complex, but if you can answer it briefly, is just we want to talk about the new government. So as many of us know, a new government was just elected. And in the audience, we want to know, what might Israel's new government mean for the occupation in East Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah specifically?
And I won't answer that. I'm not really hopeful with the new government. So Aviv.
Right. I think it's very telling. I don't think a Palestinian should be expected to or can really see difference between this new government that indeed has left, center-left parties in it, and the previous government that was very, very right-wing. So, you know, these are differences that maybe carry more weight for Israeli Jews than for Palestinians. And if we look at the most relevant ministries, the Ministry of to the issue of Jerusalem policy, the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Interior, of course, the Prime Minister office, they are held by the hawkish parts of the government, and we can't expect for anything positive to come from Ayelet Shaked or from Gideon Sa'ar and so on. Still, even this week, the first week of the new government, suddenly something that now for almost 20 years was a huge problem for Palestinians in East Jerusalem, their inability to live with their spouses from the West Bank. Okay, that Israel is denying this right from East Jerusalemites, and this is based on a law that has to be extended every I don't remember, maybe 6 months. Since this government is based on left-wing parties and on an Arab party, suddenly there is a difficulty. It was always extended automatically. Now there's a difficulty and it's not being extended, and it's unclear what will happen, and maybe things will get better in that regard. So certainly here, Amim, we are very much, and we didn't speak at all about the things that we are doing in Sheikh Jarrah, for example, but we are really thinking hard how to use this the ministers who can be more sympathetic to human rights and understand the Palestinian rights in Jerusalem, in order, yes, to maybe stop some of the policies and protect the Palestinians in East Jerusalem specifically.
Thank you, Aviv and Naveen, for touching on that. So our last part is for Amy Cohen. We would like to hear from Amy Cohen, who's Amim's Director of International Relations and Advocacy. And Amy, if you can share with us what we can do from abroad to help the situation.
Hi, thank you for having me. Amy Cohen, Director of International Relations and Advocacy for Amim. And I think, as Rachel mentioned, I want to conclude about briefly talking about what can be done from abroad on a practical level to further activism and advocacy against these eviction attempts. And I think one of the things to really highlight here is, as both Nivine and Aviv underscored, that justice cannot really be served through the Israeli judicial system because of its complicity with the settlement enterprise, eviction procedures, and so forth. And so therefore, we must find other ways and mechanisms. And when I say we, I mean civil society groups, I mean policy advocacy groups and political advocacy groups, obviously Palestinian civil society and so forth. And one of the things that was very acute over the past few months is the pivotal role that advocacy and public action at a civil society like yourselves, like NIF Canada and other civil society groups out there around the world that has and can have the ability to elicit social change and to mobilize governments to action in the face of injustice. And particularly in regard to this topic, one of the things that I actually want to kind of underscore here is that Amim has been working vis-a-vis the diplomatic and international decision-making community for years on this particular issue, and we still are. But what I want to really say here is that what we've seen here has actually been remarkable and unprecedented, particularly at least in recent memory. And it's really this level of mobilization and attention and global awareness surrounding this cause, both on a governmental level, meaning internationally, but also on a public and civil society level. It's been astounding, and it has really captured the world's attention. And I want to go back to what Nivine and Aviv spoke about very significantly, that it has largely been, and almost exclusively, I would say, driven and propelled by this impressive and extraordinary grassroots effort of civil resistance and protest among Palestinians here within Israel and Palestine, but also Palestinian civil society in many places around the globe. And what they've done is they have succeeded in activating social change and justice groups like yourselves included in that across the world, these movements that have been at the forefront of global racial reckoning over the past year, demand for racial and indigenous justice over particularly, again, the last year that we've seen. And so it's like what we've seen is this incredible fusion of Palestinians, Israelis, and then civil societies across the globe are now rallying in solidarity around this cause in very much an unparalleled and unified call against the systematic displacement and dispossession of Palestinians and powerfully demanding justice. And what it has done is it has compelled governments and leaders of the world, including Canada. I'm going to be honest with you. This has been an unprecedented level of interest. Amim has been working vis-a-vis Canada for years on this issue. We have not seen the level of interest at a governmental level until the past few months. So what I'm saying is it's unparalleled. And the reason for that is because of the mobilization of civil society, Palestinians at the forefront, but again, because of groups like yourselves that are coming along and joining and rallying around this cause and saying, we are not going to be silent. The governments of the globe and the world need to reckon with it, and intervening by exerting bilateral pressure on the Israeli government. And that is what we've been seeing over the past few months, is that we've been seeing both at a civil society level that it's exerting pressure on the Israeli government through bilateral engagement and relations. And it is remarkable to see. And so why am I emphasizing this to you is because it underscores your pivotal role as civil society actors and change agents. And so what can you do now? It's basically to capitalize and to leverage the mobilization and the momentum on this cause to elevate and to amplify the activism, both on a public level, but also vis-a-vis your particular government. Because as I shared, Canada right now, their level of interest at a governmental level is enormous. And so what I would say to you as a representative of Iramim is to ensure the issue is not sidelined, ensure the cause remains at the top priority on the public agenda, in public discourse, social media campaigns, disseminating reliable and sound resources and material from organizations like Iramim or other organizations that we work with, writing articles, hosting informational events like this webinar that you are hosting right now to equip and to arm the public with accurate information, organizing events with other progressive Jewish groups, attending protests, joining other demonstrations that are happening with other kind of Palestinian activist societies and organizations in your respective cities and obviously countries. And then on a governmental level, contact and lobby your relevant members of parliament. There are members of parliament that are actively engaged in this issue today. Lobby them, contact them, say this is a fundamental concern and interest of NIF Canada, and this issue must be addressed. Contact your senators, elected representatives, and other government officials to initiate even petitions expressing your grievances against this particular issue. And so I guess to conclude is that it is our hope that together on all of these fronts, from civil society activism to lobbying the governments, to advocacy groups like Iramim and other partner organizations, to the diplomatic and policymaker community. And in order for us together on all these fronts to really spur a strong and forthright bilateral and multilateral engagement with the Israeli government that will ultimately urge them to put a halt to these measures of mass displacement and to really ultimately undertake a sustainable and just and equitable solution that'll uphold the rights of these Palestinian families and enable them to remain safely in their homes and free from the constant dread and apprehension of being forcibly uprooted or expelled and driven from their homes and communities. And together, I believe that there is immense power in that. And so I want to encourage you and also thank you for this opportunity to hear our voices, to hear Aviv, to hear Nivine, obviously as a voice of the Palestinian struggle and the civil resistance that has been so unparalleled. And so, yeah, just want to thank you for this opportunity, and I hope that you will take it to heart and move forward at incredible levels. So thank you.
And thank you, Amy and Nivine and Aviv, for taking this opportunity to speak to us and educate our community here. So we just wanted to hear some final closing thoughts, first from Aviv and then from Nivine. Aviv, if you have any closing thoughts or final thoughts you want to share with us, that would be great.
I think Amy gave the best conclusion possible, so I'll just echo it. The Palestinians in East Jerusalem for the last 2 months have done an amazing thing that no one, I think, could have anticipated. Really, an occupied, oppressed population that's managing to rise up and protect itself and demand that its needs be addressed, and succeeding in making the Israeli government take a step back. Okay, nothing, and I'm very both humbled and both proud to be able, both as Aviv and as a part of Iramim, to be a small part of that, like supporting it in the ways that we are able to support it. The important thing to understand is that what East Jerusalemites have achieved so far is not enough, okay? Because the ideology and the government are strong enough to wait until the energy dies down and then come back again. So what Amy said is very, very true, and I think we can just receive a lot of inspiration from the grassroots East Jerusalem resistance and struggle. And if they were able to do what they did, then certainly we can carry on and take it and continue it, so that more powerful factors come in and then call the Israeli government to account and don't let it do what it wants to do.
Thank you. And Nivine, if we can hear some final
Sure.
thoughts, that'd be great.
So again, thank you so much for giving me this platform to speak and to represent what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah and in Jerusalem as well. I think this is the very first level actually of support, is to provide these platforms for the Palestinian voice to be heard. And I will also add to what Amy said is to follow and spread the hashtag that we're using, hashtag Save Sheikh Jarrah. And sometimes we also use the same hashtag as Black Lives Matter, but it's Palestinian Lives Matter. So that's, yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. So definitely that's one thing I would say. And again, even as a Palestinian, I'm 37 years old now, but for me, even as a person who have worked in peace building for the past 6 years, the level of engagement and leadership the younger generation have showed in Jerusalem is unprecedented for me. And I even wrote an article just before the events happened on youth in Jerusalem about loss of identity, and that I'm losing hope in Palestinians. And then suddenly they proved us all wrong by showing how much actually they do care and the level of tools that they have and they can utilize. And I have to say the challenges that East Jerusalem youth are facing are enormous. Not only do they live mostly under poverty, but also there's a high rate of drug abuse that's also being supported by the police, by the way. Violence, that they're facing by the Israeli police, but also sometimes internally as well, domestic violence. So it's really a very challenging and hard situation to be living in, yet they emerge, so beautifully, and they really understand the sense of grassroots resistance, nonviolent resistance. So if you're able to follow the hashtags and send them messages maybe of support or spread the videos that they are broadcasting to the world, that would be amazing. And again, thank you so much for your time and for listening.
Thank you, Nivine. And if it's okay with you, I'm just going to post the link to your article in the chat for folks that are interested in that.
Sure, of course. Thank you.
Of course, and thank you. And so thank you so much, Nivine, and thank you, Aviv and Amy, for sharing your thoughts, and Nivine specifically for sharing your experiences as a Palestinian. On behalf of the New Israel Fund of Canada New Generations Leadership Council, I want to say a very big thank you to each of you for sharing your expertise with us and all of the work that you do on the ground towards social change in Israel and Palestine. I know we went a little bit over time, but I thank you all so much for coming and for staying. And if you want to be informed of future events and aren't already on our mailing list, you can sign up to the link, sign up below. We're going to post the link in the chat. And I know we only touched on some issues here. There's so much more that we hope to discuss in future sessions with you all. Thank you again to the speakers.
Bye-bye. Thank you again.